The morning Oliver Blackwell rode onto the Wallace property. The sun had barely cracked the ridge of the Cimarron Hills, and the dust around his horse's hooves rose in thin golden spirals like something out of a fever dream. But Sallie Wallace was already standing on her porch with a shotgun resting easy across her forearm, as if she had been expecting trouble all her life and had long since made peace with it. It was the spring of 1878 in the Oklahoma Territory, where the red earth ran deep as a wound, and the wind came sweeping down off the plains with enough force to strip the bark from cottonwood trees. The territory was raw and hungry, a place where fortunes were made by men who had the nerve to take what others could not hold, and the Wallace property sat at the heart of a stretch of land that several powerful men had been eyeing for the better part of 2 years. The Cimarron River bent close to the eastern boundary of the farm, providing water that most properties in the territory would have paid dearly for, and the soil in the lower pasture was the kind of dark, silty loam that a farmer only found once in a lifetime. Sallie Wallace had worked that soil with her own 2 hands since she was 14 years old, first alongside her father, then alongside her husband Thomas, and then alone after Thomas had been taken by a fever in the autumn of 1875. She was 26 years old now, broad-shouldered and lean from hard work, with dark brown hair that she wore in a braid down her back and eyes the color of creek water in late summer, a gray-green that could look cold or warm depending on the light and on her disposition. Right now, watching the stranger ride through her gate, those eyes were decidedly cold. Oliver Blackwell was 31 years old, which made him older than Sallie, but not by the kind of gap that made people raise their eyebrows. Not that either of them was thinking about such things in that first charged moment. He was a tall man, lean but solid through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back from a face that was angular and sun-weathered, and if Sallie had been inclined to notice such things, quietly handsome in the way of men who had spent too much time outdoors to look soft about anything. He rode a bay horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been on horseback most of his life, and he was dressed well by the standards of the territory. A clean linen shirt, dark vest, brown trousers tucked into good boots. He worked for a land development company out of Wichita called Harmon & Cross, and he had been sent to the Wallace property with a leather satchel full of documents and a very specific offer: $500 for the last remaining acre of the Wallace land, the acre that sat dead center of what had once been a 400-acre farm, and was now the last piece Sallie had not been forced to sell. She had sold the rest over the past 3 years, one terrible piece at a time, whenever a debt came due or a crop failed or the roof needed mending and there was no money to mend it. Each sale had felt like cutting off a finger, and she had wept after each one privately in the dark when no one could see. But the center acre she had kept. It contained the house, the root cellar, the well, and the small garden where she grew what kept her fed through winter. More than that, it contained a flat stone beneath the old elm tree at the eastern edge of the property, where Thomas Wallace was buried, and where her father Robert was buried beside him. She would not sell that acre. She had said so to the 3 men Harmon & Cross had sent before Oliver, and she would say it again now to this 4th one, whoever he was, sitting up there on his bay horse looking at her with eyes that were darker than she expected, a deep brown, almost black, that held something she could not immediately identify. Not menace. Something more complicated than menace. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was low and even, not the practiced smoothness of a salesman but the plain directness of a man who meant what he said. "I am looking for Miss Sallie Wallace." "You found her," Sallie said, "and I imagine I know why you are here." He pulled his horse up a few yards from the porch and swung down from the saddle with one clean motion, holding the reins loose in one hand while he removed his hat with the other. It was a gesture of respect, and it surprised her slightly. The previous men from Harmon & Cross had not been the kind to remove their hats. "My name is Oliver Blackwell," he said. "I have been sent by Harmon & Cross to speak with you about your property. I would be grateful if you would hear the offer before you decide." "I have heard the offer," Sallie said. "3 times before this. The answer is no." "The offer has improved," Oliver said. He did not say it with pressure in his voice. He said it the way a man states a fact, without decoration. "They are willing to pay $600 now. That is a considerable sum, Miss Wallace." Sallie's grip on the shotgun did not change. "It is a considerable sum," she agreed. "And the answer is still no." He studied her for a moment. Not the calculating study of a man looking for a weakness, but something that felt more like genuine curiosity, as though he was looking at a puzzle and was not sure whether to solve it or simply appreciate that it was complicated. Then he nodded slowly once, as though accepting what she had said. "May I ask why?" he said. That question stopped her. The previous 3 men had not asked why. They had argued or threatened or smiled too widely and tried to make her feel foolish for holding on. None of them had simply asked. "Because it is mine," Sallie said. "That I understand," Oliver said. He settled his hat back on his head and looked out across the property, the bare yard, the small kitchen garden just beginning to show green at the edges, the old elm tree with its spreading branches catching the early light. "I am sorry to have disturbed you, Miss Wallace. I will report back to Harmon and Cross." He mounted his horse again. Sallie watched him with narrowed eyes, waiting for the catch, for the turn in his approach, for the move that men like this always had waiting in reserve. But he simply settled into his saddle and touched the brim of his hat and began to ride back toward the gate. "That is it," she called after him. He looked back over his shoulder. "I was sent to present an offer. You declined. There is nothing more to be done today." She stood there watching him ride out through her gate and down the road that ran west toward the town of Caldwell, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, not relief exactly, and not suspicion, but something more unsettled than either. Something that sat under her ribs and did not go away quietly. She went inside and set the shotgun against the wall and put the kettle on the stove, and she told herself that Oliver Blackwell was just another man doing the bidding of people richer than himself, and that she would not think about him again. She was wrong about that. 3 days later, Oliver Blackwell came back. This time he did not ride through the gate with leather satchels and offers. He arrived on foot, coming up the road from Caldwell just past mid-morning, and he was carrying a small wooden crate that he set down in the yard when Sallie came to the door. "I am not here on behalf of Harmon and Cross today," he said before she could speak. "I am here on my own account." Sallie looked at the crate. "What is that?" "Seed potatoes," he said. "I noticed your kitchen garden from the road the other day. The soil on the western side looks like it could support a good potato crop, but I did not see any planted. I was in Caldwell this morning and the general store had a surplus and I thought—" He stopped, as though hearing himself and finding it awkward. "I thought you might want them. You are not obliged to accept them." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. The sun was warm on the yard and a meadowlark was singing somewhere in the elm tree, and Oliver Blackwell was standing in her dirt yard with a crate of seed potatoes and an expression that was doing its best to appear casual and was not quite succeeding. "Why?" she said. "Because I can see you are running a difficult operation alone," he said, and his voice was honest without being pitying, which was a line that mattered considerably to Sallie Wallace. "And because the land company will not take your answer from me. They will send someone else, and he will likely not be as polite as I have tried to be. I thought that if the property looked more actively cultivated, it might complicate their argument that the land is not being used to its potential." Sallie was quiet for a moment. "So the potatoes are a tactical suggestion." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. "Partly," he said. "And the other part?" "The other part is that you look like you could use seed potatoes," he said plainly. Something shifted in Sallie's chest. Not a dramatic shifting, not the kind that she could have named on the spot, but a small movement, like a door settling on its hinges when the weather changes. "I will take them," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." "Oliver," he said. "That is acceptable." "Oliver," she repeated carefully, testing the weight of it. "You can call me Sallie," he nodded. "I should tell you something, Sallie, and I want to tell you plainly because I think you deserve plain dealing. Harmon and Cross will not give up on this property. They need this acre to complete a purchase of the surrounding land that they have already mostly consolidated. Without this piece, the whole project is hampered. They will push harder." "They have been pushing for 2 years," Sallie said. "I have not moved." "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like admiration. "I read through the whole file on the way here from Wichita. Every offer, every refusal. You have held on through a great deal." Sallie looked away toward the elm tree, its branches full of new spring leaves. "My husband is buried under that tree," she said. "My father, too. There is not an amount of money that covers that." Oliver was quiet for a long moment. When she looked back at him, his expression had changed. The professional composure had softened into something that looked very much like genuine understanding. "I am sorry for your losses," he said. "Thank you," Sallie said. Then, because she had not offered anything to anyone in a long time, and the gesture felt strange and important at the same time, "Will you stay for coffee?" He blinked, clearly surprised. "I would not want to impose. It is a cup of coffee, Oliver, not a lifelong obligation." He stayed for coffee. He stayed, in fact, for most of the morning, because Sallie had a fence post on the south side of the garden that had rotted at the base and was leaning dangerously. And after he mentioned it, she could not help saying that she had been meaning to fix it for 3 weeks, and he could not help saying that he had nothing pressing in Caldwell until the afternoon. And somehow the conversation ended with him digging out the old post with the short-handled spade from the linta, while she set the new post she had been keeping in the barn. It was good work, the kind of work that sits in the hands and the muscles in a satisfying way, and they did it mostly in silence, with occasional practical exchanges about depth and angle and tamping down the soil around the base. Sallie found, to her mild unease, that it was not uncomfortable to have him working beside her. It was, in fact, quite comfortable. He worked without complaint and without the excessive helpfulness that some men offered as a way of demonstrating their superiority. He simply worked. "How long have you been working for Harmon and Cross?" she asked when they were packing the earth around the new post. "For years," he said. "I came out from Ohio after my father's farm was sold to pay debts. I needed work and they were hiring men who could ride and talk to people." "Did you enjoy it?" He considered the question seriously. "At the start I thought I was helping people, connecting them with buyers, making transactions that worked for everyone. And sometimes that was true." He paused. "But the work has changed. Or perhaps I have changed and the work has stayed the same and I can see it more clearly now." "You mean you have been sent to pressure people into selling things they do not want to sell," Sallie said, not unkindly. He met her eyes. "Yes, that is what I mean." She appreciated that he did not dress it up. "You could find different work." "I could," he agreed. "I have been considering it." They finished the fence post and Sallie made a second cup of coffee and brought it out to the porch, and they sat in the 2 wooden chairs and looked out at the property, the kitchen garden with its rows of turned earth, the newly planted seed potatoes going in on the west side, the lean-to and the barn and the old elm tree with the flat stone beneath it catching the afternoon light. The meadowlark was still singing. "It is beautiful land," Oliver said, and it did not sound like a man appraising a potential purchase. It sounded like a man saying something true. "Yes," Sallie said softly, "it is." He left in the early afternoon, and she watched him walk down the road toward Caldwell, and she told herself again that he was an agent of the land company that wanted to take the last thing she owned, and that she should not be sitting on her porch feeling a pleasant warmth in her chest just because a man had helped her set a fence post. She told herself that twice more over the next 2 days, but it helped less each time. Oliver sent a letter to Harmon and Cross from Caldwell, informing them that Miss Wallace had declined the latest offer and that he believed further offers would meet the same result. He expected a terse reply. What he received instead was a letter from Gerald Cross himself. the younger and less patient of the two partners, informing him that the company's patience with the Wallace property had expired, and that if Oliver could not conclude the matter within the next 30 days, they would engage a man named Hector Prout to handle it instead. Oliver knew who Hector Prout was. Most people who operated in the Oklahoma Territory did. Prout was not a lawyer and not a land agent. He was the kind of man that men like Gerald Cross hired when they were done asking politely, and the methods he used were not methods that any reasonable person would describe as polite. He had a history in the territory of mysterious barn fires and missing livestock and neighbors who suddenly found it expedient to relocate. Oliver sat in his room at the Caldwell Hotel and read the letter 3 times and felt something cold and heavy settle in his stomach. He thought about Sallie Wallace on her porch with her shotgun and her gray-green eyes, and the flat stone under the elm tree where her husband and her father lay. He thought about the fence post they had set together, and the way she had handed him his coffee without ceremony, as though she expected him to be able to manage a cup without being fussed over. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and went to the livery stable for his horse. He found her in the kitchen garden when he arrived, on her knees between the rows with her hands in the soil, checking the moisture depth. She looked up when she heard the horse and her expression ran through a quick sequence: surprise, wariness, something that might have been relief, which she appeared to try to suppress. "Oliver," she said, sitting back on her heels, "I did not expect you today." "I need to tell you something," he said, and he got down from the horse and came to the edge of the garden. "I received a letter from Harmon and Cross. They are giving me 30 days to conclude the matter with your property. If you do not sell, they will send a man named Hector Prout." Sallie's expression went still and careful. "I know that name." "Then you know what his involvement would mean," Oliver said. He was watching her face. "I want you to understand that I had no part in that decision, and I want you to understand something else." He paused because this was the part that was more complicated to say. "I am not going to help them force you off this land, Sallie. Whatever happens with Harmon and Cross, I will not be part of that." She looked at him for a long moment. The breeze moved through the elm tree and ruffled the hem of her skirt, and she put her dirty hand up to shade her eyes against the sun. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you deserve to know it," he said, "and because you need time to prepare if Prout is coming." "And what does preparing look like in your estimation?" she said. There was an edge in her voice, but underneath it was something that sounded like she was genuinely asking. "You should talk to the county sheriff," Oliver said. "Walt Dempsey. I spoke with him briefly in Caldwell yesterday, on other business, and he struck me as a man who takes his duty seriously. If Prout does anything that can be documented, anything that constitutes harassment or damage to your property, Dempsey will act on it. The law has not always been quick to act on behalf of widows in the territory," Sallie said, and her voice was dry and accurate. "I know," Oliver said. "I am not saying it is a perfect solution. I am saying it is a layer of protection." She stood up from the garden and brushed the soil from her skirts and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had been managing to unsettle him since the morning he first rode through her gate. "You rode out here to warn me," she said. "Yes. Even though it puts you at odds with your employers." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come inside. I'm making bread, and I am not going to just stand here in the garden having this conversation. You can sit at the table." He followed her inside. The kitchen was small and warm, with a cast-iron stove and a wooden table and shelves along one wall holding the kind of careful, organized stores that a person maintains when they are not sure how long those stores have to last. It smelled of flour and wood smoke, and something faintly floral that he later identified as the dried lavender she kept in a small jar on the windowsill. She had her hands in the bread dough before she spoke again. "Tell me about Prout," she said. "What exactly would he do?" Oliver told her. He told her everything he knew, which he had gathered over 4 years of working adjacent to men like Prout without ever working alongside them. Prout would start small: a gate left open, a section of fence cut so that livestock strayed. He would escalate if those tactics did not work. He had associates, men who would do more serious damage for a fee. He would never do anything himself that could be directly traced back to him or to Harmon and Cross. Sallie worked the dough while he talked, and her hands were steady and strong and her face was concentrated. She asked questions that were sharp and practical. Did Prout work alone or bring men with him? What was his usual timeline? Were there things he typically avoided, things that were more trouble than they were worth to him? Oliver answered each question as honestly as he could, and found himself watching her hands in the dough, and thinking that there was a kind of courage in the way she received hard information, not with panic or with the false bravado that some people use to cover panic, but with a focused, methodical attention that made him feel he was speaking to someone genuinely capable of handling what was coming. "I will go and see Walt Dempsey tomorrow," she said finally, shaping the loaf and setting it to rise on the shelf. "And I will write to my neighbor Cy Haverford on the north side. He sold his parcel to Harmon and Cross 2 years ago, but he is not a man who likes Prout. He told me as much when the sale was done. He might be willing to keep an eye on things." "That is good thinking," Oliver said. She washed her hands in the basin and dried them on her apron and looked at him directly. "What will you tell Harmon and Cross?" "I will tell them that I have not yet concluded the matter," he said. "Which will be true. And in 30 days, he met her gaze, "in 30 days I expect I will need to find new employment." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the careful tension she wore as a default. "That is a serious thing to sacrifice," she said. "I find that some things make the sacrifice simple," he said, and he said it looking at her, and she looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the bread dough sat on the shelf rising in the warm kitchen, and outside the meadowlark was singing again in the elm tree. Oliver rode back to Caldwell, and Sallie went to see Walt Dempsey the next morning, arriving at the sheriff's office just as the deputy was unlocking the door at 7:30. Dempsey himself came in 20 minutes later, a stocky man of 50 with a gray mustache and the measured patience of a man who had spent 30 years dealing with other people's crises. He listened to everything Sallie said without interrupting, which she respected, and when she was finished, he folded his hands on his desk and said that he knew of Hector Prout, that Prout was not welcome to operate in his county, and that if anything happened on or around the Wallace property that bore Prout's mark, he would personally ride out to deal with it. He also said, because he was an honest man, that he could not put a deputy on the road outside her property indefinitely, and that she should be prepared to respond to smaller provocations on her own until he was called for. He said it without condescension, as a statement of practical reality. Sallie thanked him and rode home and spent the afternoon preparing what she could. She checked the latches on the barn and the lean-to. She moved the 2 chickens she had left into the root cellar at night, where they would be harder to get at. She cleaned the shotgun and put fresh shells where she could reach them quickly, and she pulled out the old Winchester rifle that had been Thomas's and ran an old cloth over it and loaded it and hung it on the hooks above the mantelpiece. She was not afraid exactly. She was alert, the way the land itself was alert in spring, everything coiled and waiting. Oliver came back the following Friday. He did not come with anything in his hands this time, no seed potatoes, no pretense of official business. He came and knocked on the door in the late afternoon, and when Sallie answered it, he said, without preamble, "I would like to take you to supper in Caldwell if you are willing. There is a reasonable establishment on the main street that sets a decent table." Sallie looked at him. "Is this related to the property?" "No," he said. "It is related to the fact that I would like to have supper with you." She considered him for a moment, the dark eyes and the quiet steadiness and the way he stood on her porch without any performance, just himself. Then she said, "Give me a few minutes to wash up." The restaurant in Caldwell was a simple place with wooden tables and oil lamps, and a cook who had come out from Missouri 3 years ago, and knew how to do something worthwhile with beef and onions. They sat at a table by the window, and the town moved outside in the evening light. Horses at the rail and men calling to each other across the street, and a woman with a baby on her hip standing in the doorway of the general store. They talked for 2 hours over supper, and then coffee, and then pie that neither of them particularly needed but both agreed to. They talked about Ohio, where Oliver had grown up, a different world from this one, greener and smaller and more bounded. They talked about Sallie's father, Robert Wallace, who had come to the Oklahoma Territory from Tennessee in 1860 and had broken the first ground of the farm with nothing but a borrowed plow, and a profound conviction that the land would reward him if he treated it with respect. They talked about Thomas briefly, carefully. Oliver did not press, and Sallie did not volunteer more than she was ready to share. But she shared enough for him to understand that she had loved Thomas Wallace with a complete and unsentimental love, the kind that comes from working side by side through hard weather. "You have been alone for 3 years," Oliver said, not as a judgment but as an acknowledgment of something that plainly mattered. "I have not minded it as much as people seem to think I should," Sallie said. "I do not dislike my own company." "No," he said, looking at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile but carried warmth in it. "I do not imagine you do." "Do you?" she said. "Mind being alone?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have been alone for a long time," he said, "moving from place to place for Harmon and Cross, staying in hotel rooms, eating supper alone. I think I told myself it suited me because it was easier than admitting that it did not." It was a candid thing to say, and she received it as such without deflecting it or making it smaller. "What will you do," she said, "when you leave Harmon and Cross?" He looked out at the darkening street. "There are ranches north of here that take on skilled hands. I am a fair carpenter and I know cattle. I could find a place." He paused. "I have been thinking about land of my own. A small piece, somewhere with good water." Sallie looked at him across the table in the lamplight and felt the warmth in her chest again, that small, settled movement she had been noticing since the morning he had brought the seed potatoes. It was not simple to feel, and she did not try to make it simple. She only knew it was there. On the ride back to her property in the dark, with Oliver riding alongside her and the night sky overhead thick with stars. The Oklahoma sky in May was something that had to be seen to be understood. An entire universe poured out above the flat dark land. Sallie found herself thinking about what it might mean to let someone into the careful, defended life she had been building. Not with fear exactly. More with a kind of wondering attention, the way she looked at new growth in the garden, curious and careful in equal measure. At her gate she stopped and he stopped beside her. The horses stood quietly in the dark, and above them the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns. "Thank you for supper," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Then Sallie said, "Come by when you can, Oliver. Not on Harmon and Cross's business. Just come by." He nodded, and there was something in his face in the starlight that made her feel it meant something to him, being invited. She rode through the gate and he turned his horse for town, and she went inside and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment before lighting the lamp, holding the warmth in her chest like a candle flame cupped against the wind. The trouble with Prout came 10 days later, earlier than Oliver had predicted. It was a Tuesday, gray and close, with a low sky threatening rain that had not yet arrived. Sallie was in the barn repairing a harness when she heard her remaining horse, the roan mare named Bess, shout and shy in her stall in a way that meant something she did not like was nearby. Sallie came out of the barn and found 2 men she did not know standing in her yard, one by the well and one near the garden. They were not threatening, precisely. They had their hands at their sides and their expressions were carefully neutral, but they had come through her gate without calling out, which was wrong, and there was a third horse tied at the gate that she had not heard arrive, which meant they had come quietly and deliberately. "Can I help you?" she said, and her voice was level, and she had the sense to have brought the short-handled spade with her out of the barn, which she held loose in both hands. "Just passing through, ma'am," said the one by the well. He had a reddish beard and cold eyes that did not match his pleasant tone. "You are not passing through," Sallie said. "You are standing in my yard, so I will ask you to state your business or get off my property." The second man, shorter and darker, was looking at the kitchen garden and she saw him calculate something. She tightened her grip on the spade. "Harmon and Cross sent us," the first man said, dropping the pretense, "to encourage you to reconsider. The offer is still open." "Get off my property," Sallie said. "Now, ma'am, there is no reason to be unfriendly. I said get off my property." Her voice did not shake. "I have a sheriff who knows your names, and I have a rifle inside that door, and I have patience for exactly 2 more seconds." She did not have their names, but they did not know that. The man with the reddish beard looked at his companion, and something passed between them. A calculation about whether this woman was bluffing. And evidently they decided she was not, because after a long moment the first man spat in the dirt, and they walked back through the gate and mounted the third horse and the first man's horse and rode west without looking back. Sallie waited until they were out of sight and then sat down on the step of the lean-to, because her legs had decided they were done holding her up for the moment. She breathed carefully, once, twice, 3 times, and then stood up again and went inside and wrote a note to Walt Dempsey describing both men in detail, and sent it to town with the seed merchant who passed her gate every Tuesday. She wrote a second note to Oliver, saying simply that there had been a visit and that she was well, and sent it with the same merchant. Oliver arrived the next morning before 8 o'clock, and when she opened the door his face held a controlled intensity that told her the note had worried him. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. He listened with his hands clasped and his jaw tight, and when she described the 2 men he said that the description of the one with the reddish beard sounded like a man named Cord Levis who had done work for Prout before. He said it flatly, without dramatics, but the tight quality of his expression did not ease. "They will come back," he said. "Probably," Sallie said. "Sallie," he looked at her, "I think you should let me stay." "Not inside the house," he added quickly, with a clarity that made her appreciate him. "There is the lean-to, and I have slept in far worse, but closer to the property at night." She looked at him for a moment. "You would do that?" "Yes. You would lose your employment entirely if you are seen here." "I already sent a letter to Harmon and Cross last week," he said quietly, "telling them I could not continue to act on their behalf in this matter. I am no longer in their employ." Sallie felt the full weight of what that meant settle over her. He had done it before the men came, before the intimidation attempt. He had made his choice without knowing the stakes would rise so quickly. "Oliver," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth now, fuller somehow. "You do not need to say anything," he said. "Let me be useful, that is all I am asking." "All right," she said. "The lean-to needs a new latch on the door, but the cot inside is serviceable." He slept in the lean-to that night and the next, and during the days he was more useful than any single hired hand Sallie could have found in Caldwell. He knew cattle. She had only 1 steer left, but he knew what to look for in its health, and he knew building. And he spent an entire day repointing the mortar on the chimney that had been crumbling since last fall, working on a borrowed ladder with a methodical care that she watched from the garden with something she might have admitted privately was appreciation for more than just the work. Walt Dempsey rode out on the 3rd day and spoke to Oliver and Sallie together, telling them that the description of Cord Levis had been confirmed. He had been seen in Caldwell 2 days prior in the company of another man who was known to Dempsey. The sheriff said he had made it known to both men that they would be arrested if found on the Wallace property, and he believed they understood his meaning. He said this with the measured confidence of a man who knew his own authority, and Sallie believed him. That evening, Sallie made a supper of beef and potatoes and cornbread, and they ate at the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them. And outside the first spring thunderstorm came rolling in off the plains with the characteristic grandeur of Oklahoma, whether lightning cracking against the far hills, and the rain coming down in sheets against the windows and the elm tree thrashing in the dark beyond the glass. Oliver said, "I want to tell you something." Sallie looked at him across the table. The lamplight made his face warm, catching the lines of it, the places where weather and time had settled into him. "I came to this property 3 weeks ago to do a job I should not have taken," he said, "and I have spent every day since being glad that you refused me." Sallie was quiet. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said. "I only want to say it because it is true and because you deserve honest things." "You said that before," she said quietly, "that I deserve plain dealing." "You do," he said. She looked at her hands on the table. Thomas had been gone 3 years, and she had not expected this, had not been watching for it, had not prepared for the specific feeling of sitting across a table from a man who told her plain truths and then waited, without demanding, for her to respond. "I am grateful for you being here," she said finally, "and not only because of Prout." His eyes held hers. "I am glad," he said. The rain came on harder, and the lamp flickered in the draught through the window seams, and the thunder rolled across the hills. And they sat at the table until late into the night, talking about things that had nothing to do with land disputes, about books, because she had a shelf of them and he had noticed them the first time he sat in this kitchen, about the way the territory had changed in the 15 years since the great cattle drives had begun, about what kind of life a person could build on a single good acre if they were patient enough and stubborn enough. He slept in the lean-to, and she lay awake in her bed listening to the rain and thinking about the way he had said, "I find that some things make the sacrifice simple," looking at her when he said it, and she pressed her hand flat against the quilt Thomas had helped her make their first winter on the farm, and let herself feel both things at once, the grief that would never fully leave and the new warmth that was beginning to feel like something that might stay. In the second week of June, Hector Prout himself arrived. He came on a fine horse and alone, which surprised both Sallie and Oliver, who had expected him to come in force. He was a narrow man of about 50, with a spare face and pale eyes, and the kind of economy of movement that spoke of someone who had learned long ago that most things could be accomplished without effort if you approached them correctly. He rode through the gate at midday without calling out, and he found both Oliver and Sallie in the yard. Oliver had been repairing the lean-to roof, and had come down from the ladder at the sound of the horse, and Sallie had come out of the garden. Prout looked at Oliver, and something shifted briefly in his pale eyes before his face went neutral again. "You must be Blackwell," he said. "Cross mentioned you had gone soft." "I have gone clear-eyed," Oliver said. He did not move toward Prout or away from him. He stood easy with his thumbs in his belt. "What is your business here, Prout?" "Same as always," Prout said, and looked at Sallie. "Miss Wallace, I'm here on behalf of Harmon and Cross with what I am told is a final offer, $700 for this acre." "No," Sallie said. Prout looked at her with his pale eyes. "That is a great deal of money." "I know what it is," Sallie said, "and I know what you are. I have met 2 of your men already this month. If they or you or anyone connected to this matter sets foot on my property without permission again, I will have Walt Dempsey involved before the sun moves a hand's width." Something that might have been respect moved briefly in Prout's face, or might have been amusement. With a face as economical as his, it was difficult to read the difference. He looked at Oliver again. "You have cost yourself a great deal over a woman who has not even said she wants your help," Prout said. "She said it," Oliver replied. "You were not there." Prout sat on his horse for a moment longer and then did something that surprised both of them. He touched the brim of his hat to Sallie, a gesture that was entirely sincere, and said, "I have done a great deal of things in this territory that do not recommend themselves on reflection, but I take honest grit where I find it." He looked at Oliver. "Cross will not let this rest with an offer. You know what comes next." "Whatever comes next, we will be ready for it," Oliver said. Prout nodded once, turned his horse, and rode out through the gate. He did not look back. They stood in the yard in the June heat, and the sound of the horse faded down the road, and then there was only the meadowlark and the wind in the elm tree. "He respected you," Oliver said. There was something in his voice that was not quite surprise, more like confirmation of something he had already known. "I do not need his respect," Sallie said. "No," Oliver said, "but it was honest, and out here that matters." What came next, as Prout had predicted, was a legal maneuver. Harmon and Cross filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office in Guthrie, arguing that the Wallace property had been sold in its entirety as part of a prior agreement with Sallie's late husband Thomas, and that the acre she retained was improperly held. It was a manufactured claim. The documents they presented had discrepancies that anyone looking closely would notice, but it required a response, and the response required a lawyer, and lawyers in the Oklahoma Territory in 1878 were not inexpensive. Oliver handled it. He wrote to a man named Frederick Aldridge in Guthrie, a lawyer he had dealt with on legitimate land transactions during his time with Harmon and Cross, and who he knew to have both the skill and the integrity to take on a case like this one. Aldridge agreed to look at the documents for a modest fee, and when he examined them, he wrote back within a week to say that the signatures on the Harmon and Cross documents did not match the authenticated signatures in the territorial records for Thomas Wallace, and that he believed the claim could be challenged and dismissed. Oliver paid Aldridge's fee from his own savings without saying anything to Sallie about it. Sallie found out because Aldridge, being a thorough man, sent copies of his correspondence to all parties, and one of those copies mentioned Mr. Oliver Blackwell's retainer. Sallie held that letter in her kitchen and read it twice, and then set it on the table and stood very still for a moment. Oliver was out back splitting wood. He had been doing that every other day, keeping the woodpile in a state that would see the farm through the next winter, and she went out and stood a few feet from him until he noticed her. He set down the axe. When he saw her expression, he said, "I was going to tell you. You paid for a lawyer on my behalf without asking me," she said. "Yes. That is a significant thing to do without asking." "I know," he said. "I am sorry I did not ask. I was afraid you would refuse it, and you need this lawyer, Sallie. The claim they filed is fraudulent, but it needs to be fought in the proper way." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was high and the wood chips were bright in the dirt around the chopping block, and his shirt was damp from the work, and his face was open and direct and a little worried. "I am going to pay you back," she said. "You do not. I am going to pay you back," she said again firmly. "I am not a charity case, and I will not be treated as one, Oliver, but She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "Thank you for doing it, for thinking of it." For she stopped again because the words she was reaching for were larger than the occasion, and she was not yet ready to say them. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had been doing complicated things to her composure for weeks. "You are welcome," he said. She took 2 steps toward him, and then, because she had always been someone who made her decisions and then acted on them, she took 2 more, and she put her hand on his chest, flat against the damp linen over his heart, and looked up at him. He went very still. "I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said quietly. "And I am not a woman who lets things go unsaid when they want to be said." "No," he agreed, his voice low. "I have noticed that. I am going to say this once, and I am going to say it clearly," she said. "I did not expect you. I was not looking for you. You came here to buy the last thing I owned, and I sent you away, and you came back with seed potatoes and a willingness to set fence posts, and I have been trying for weeks to keep this feeling in its proper place, and I am not sure it has a proper place." His hand came up and covered hers on his chest. His palm was warm and rough from the work, and she felt his heartbeat under her hand, steadier than she had expected. "I am not asking you for anything," he said, echoing his words from the night of the thunderstorm, but differently now, with something deeper underneath them. "But I will tell you that I drove out of your gate that first morning thinking I had never in my life met a woman like you, and I have not found a reason since to change my mind." "Oliver," she said. "Sallie," he said back, and his hand tightened over hers, and the warmth in her chest that had been a candle flame since the morning of the seed potatoes opened like a door into a lit room. He bent his head, and she lifted her chin, and they kissed in the bright June noon beside the chopping block, with the meadowlark going on in the elm tree and the smell of fresh-cut wood in the air, and it was not a tentative kiss or a polite one. It was the kind of kiss that two people exchange when they have been thinking about it for weeks and have finally given themselves permission. And it said what they had both been carefully not saying, and it said it completely. When they stepped back from each other, Sally's face had a quality he had not seen on it before, softened, open, without the careful armor she usually wore. And he thought, looking at her, that he would spend a very long time trying to be worthy of the privilege of seeing her face like that. The legal claim filed by Harmon and Cross was dismissed by the Guthrie Land Office in early July, 2 weeks after Aldridge filed his response. The dismissal was noted, and the claim was formally stricken from the record, and Frederick Aldridge sent a copy of the dismissal documents to Sallie with a brief note congratulating her on the clarity of her case. Sallie read the documents and put them in the cedar box where she kept important papers, and went out to the elm tree, and stood for a while by the flat stones where Thomas and her father lay. She talked to them the way she sometimes did when the house was quiet, not out loud, but in the private interior way of someone who has not forgotten the people who made her who she was. She told Thomas that she was going to be all right. She told her father that the farm was still standing. She put her hand briefly on each stone, warm from the summer sun, and then she straightened up and went back to the house where Oliver was sitting on the porch reading the almanac, because he had taken to reading the almanac in the evenings the way other men read newspapers, with careful attention to its predictions about weather and growing seasons. She sat down in the other chair and he looked up and she said, "It is over. The claim has been dismissed." He let out a breath. Something in his shoulders came down. "Good," he said, simply and completely. "Gerald Cross will be furious," she said. "Probably," Oliver agreed, "but there is nothing more he can do here. He has used his last legal tool and it has failed. He will move on to other properties." "Other people who cannot fight back as well," Sallie said quietly. "Yes," Oliver said. "That is the truth of it." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land, her land, all 1 acre of it, green and particular in the evening light. "We should think about whether there is anything that can be done more broadly, about the way companies like Harmon and Cross operate in the territory." Oliver looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "Aldridge would know," she said. "Whether there are organizing bodies or representatives to the territorial government or legal instruments that could protect smallholders better. I would like to know what we can do besides fight each battle individually." Oliver set down the almanac. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn when he first asked her why she would not sell, that expression of genuine, absorbed curiosity. "You are thinking about this on behalf of other people," he said. "I am fortunate that I had resources," Sallie said. "My father's records were impeccable. You knew the right lawyer. Not everyone would have those things. And there are people all over this territory who have already been pushed off land that was theirs." She looked at him. "If we know what happened here and we know how it works, it seems wrong to just be relieved it is over and not look further." He looked at her for a long moment and then said, in a tone that was equal parts wonder and resolution, "I admire you, Sallie Wallace. I admired you the first morning I rode through that gate, and I think I will admire you every day of my life." She felt the heat of that land on her face and the warm complexity of everything she felt for him, and she said, "Then I suppose you had better stick around long enough to do so." He laughed, a full, open laugh that she had heard from him only a few times, and that she had found each time to be one of the finest sounds she knew. And she laughed with him, there on the porch in the July evening, with the land all around them and the elm tree catching the last of the light. On an August evening when the heat had finally begun to soften, and the night smelled of dry grass and distant rain, Oliver Blackwell asked Sallie Wallace to marry him. He did not do it elaborately. He was not an elaborate man, and she was not a woman who would have wanted elaboration, and he knew her well enough by then to understand that. He did it in the kitchen after supper, standing up from the table while she was washing the dishes, and he said her name in the tone he used only when he meant something precisely, and she turned around drying her hands on the dish cloth, and he said, I want to build a life here with you on this land. Not because I want the land. Because I want to be wherever you are. Will you marry me?" Sallie looked at him. She had known it was coming. She was not a woman who missed things that were building, and she had thought about how she would feel when it arrived and found that the reality was considerably more affecting than the anticipation. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Oliver." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her face in his hands and kissed her with all the tenderness and certainty of a man who has waited for the right thing and found it. And she put her arms around him and held him and felt the solidity of him, the realness of him, in a way that filled the spaces in her chest that had been empty for 3 years. They were married in October by the minister in Caldwell, with Walt Dempsey as witness and Cy Haverford, and his wife Marta standing beside them in the small white church on the main street. The elm tree was fully golden on their wedding day, dropping leaves in slow spirals over the flat stones beneath it. And when they came home from Caldwell in the afternoon light, and Sallie walked through the gate that Oliver had repaired 3 months earlier, she felt the acre of her land receive them both with what she could only describe as rightness. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and long and full of work, as winters in the Oklahoma Territory always were, and they moved through it together with the ease of 2 people who have always known how to work and have found in each other a partner who does not make the work lighter exactly, but makes it more worth the doing. Oliver found consulting work with Frederick Aldridge in Guthrie, helping to identify fraudulent land claims and assist small landholders with documentation work that used everything he had learned in 4 years with Harmon and Cross, and turned it into something he did not have to be ashamed of. He rode to Guthrie twice a month and came home with the satisfaction of someone who is using his abilities honestly, and the money was modest but sufficient, and combined with what Sallie produced from the garden and the farm it was enough. In the spring, they broke new ground on the east side of the property, on the acre that was Sallie's, and planted a kitchen garden twice the size of the previous one, and built a proper chicken coop for the 4 hens Oliver had bought in Caldwell, and in the south corner of the yard, well away from the flat stones under the elm tree, they set the foundation for an addition to the house. The addition was because Sallie told Oliver in March that she was expecting a child, and told him on a Sunday morning while they were both in the kitchen, and he received the news standing very still for a moment, and then sitting down in the kitchen chair with an expression on his face that moved through several distinct registers: astonishment, joy, something that looked very much like wonder before he looked at her and said, "A child." "A child," she confirmed. He stood up and took her hands and held them and looked at her with those dark eyes that still, after 6 months of marriage, managed to do something to her composure, and he said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I have never felt more well in my life," and meant both things. Their son was born in November of 1879, delivered by the Caldwell midwife in the bedroom of the expanded house, while Oliver sat in the kitchen with Walt Dempsey, who had arrived unannounced with a bottle of good whiskey, and the declaration that he was not leaving until he knew everyone was safe, which Sallie would later say was entirely consistent with her understanding of the man's character. The boy came into the world with a full set of opinions, loudly expressed, and black hair exactly like Oliver's, and hands that Sallie held in both of hers in the first quiet hour and thought were the most extraordinary things she had ever seen. They named him Robert Thomas Blackwell, for her father and her first husband, and Oliver did not hesitate for a moment about that, which told Sallie everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Oliver held his son in the kitchen, while Walt Dempsey poured 2 fingers of whiskey in a quiet celebration, and the baby regarded him with the ancient calm of newborns who have not yet decided whether the world deserves their attention, and Oliver looked back at his son with an expression of such unguarded love that Walt Dempsey looked away, because the moment seemed too private to witness. Robert Thomas grew into a loud, happy, curious boy who was walking before anyone expected him to, and talking shortly after that, mostly about things he had observed in the garden or the yard, delivered with the confident authority of someone who has recently discovered that the world is full of interesting information and intends to share all of it. The following spring, Gerald Cross made one final attempt on the Wallace, now Blackwell property, sending a letter through a Guthrie lawyer offering $800. Oliver and Sallie read the letter together at the kitchen table, while Robert Thomas played on the floor with a set of carved wooden blocks that Oliver had made him over the winter. Sallie put the letter down and looked at Oliver. Oliver looked back at her. They had lived on this acre for a year and a half as husband and wife, and in that time they had expanded the garden and built the chicken coop and added 2 rooms to the house and planted a plum tree on the north side and replaced the barn roof and repaired the well housing and made enough changes and improvements to the property that it looked, to anyone passing on the road, like exactly what it was, a place that was being cared for with full and permanent intention. "No," Sallie said. Oliver took a piece of notepaper and wrote, simply, "The Wallace Blackwell property is not for sale and will not be for sale. Do not write to this address again." He signed it with both their names and posted it the next day in Caldwell. No further letters came from Gerald Cross. Frederick Aldridge wrote in early 1880 to say that he had brought the pattern of Harmon and Cross's fraudulent documentation before a territorial court in Guthrie, with evidence drawn from 9 separate cases including the Wallace case, and that the court had imposed significant restrictions on the company's operations in the Oklahoma Territory. Gerald Cross had, Aldridge reported with what was evidently some professional satisfaction, been required to pay restitution to several property holders who had been pressured into below-market sales. Harmon himself had evidently retired to Kansas with damaged reputation. Oliver read the letter aloud at breakfast, and Robert Thomas, who was 14 months old and ate his breakfast with focused enthusiasm, banged his spoon on his bowl in what might have been enthusiasm or might have been coincidence, but which they both chose to receive as the former. "Your father would have been pleased," Oliver said, looking at Sallie. She thought of Robert Wallace, who had come to this territory in 1860 with a borrowed plow and a conviction that the land would reward honest treatment. "Yes," she said, "he would have been." Cy Haverford and his wife, Marta, came to dinner that evening, and they celebrated with the good wine that Marta brought from her kitchen stores, and they sat on the porch after dinner in the warm spring evening, while the children, the Haverfords, had 2 small ones of their own, played in the yard, and the elm tree moved quietly in the dark above the stones where Thomas and Robert Wallace lay. Oliver's hand found Sallie's in the dark of the porch, and she laced her fingers through his and leaned slightly against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the evening had not already said. In the summer of 1880, Sallie discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Oliver in the evening by the elm tree, standing in the long gold light with the Cimarron Hills pale on the horizon. He pulled her close and held her, and she could feel the steady drumbeat of his heart against her cheek, and the warmth of his hand on her back, and the absolute certainty of him, which was the thing she had not known she needed most and had found without looking. Their second child, a girl, was born in February of 1881, arriving in a snowstorm that kept the midwife stranded in Caldwell and meant that Oliver delivered her himself, which was the most frightening thing he had ever done, and also, he would tell people later, the most important. The girl came into the world with her mother's gray-green eyes and a temperament that was immediately, observably different from her brother's, quieter, more watchful, taking in everything before committing to a reaction. They named her Clara Mee Blackwell, and Robert Thomas, who was 2 years old by then and considered himself the foremost authority on all matters pertaining to the household, inspected his sister with great seriousness for a full minute before declaring her acceptable, which was the highest praise he was prepared to offer at that stage of his development. In the years that followed, the Blackwell farm on the single acre of the former Wallace property grew in layers, the way that good things grow not all at once but steadily, each season adding something. The garden expanded. A second well was dug on the west side. Oliver built a proper workshop in the lean-to's expanded space and took on carpentry commissions from the ranches and homesteads within a day's ride, becoming known in the region as a man who built things square and finished them properly and charged an honest price. Sallie's knowledge of the land, accumulated over a lifetime and refined in the 3 years she had run the property alone, became something she shared deliberately with Marta Haverford, with the new families who came to settle near Caldwell, with the women at the church quilting circle who were trying to understand how to make a kitchen garden produce through the dry Oklahoma summers. She was not a woman who gave advice unsolicited, but when it was asked for she gave it fully and practically, without condescension, and people trusted it. Oliver's work with Aldridge in Guthrie eventually led to a formal appointment as a land documentation officer for the territorial government, a modest official position that paid a modest official salary and allowed him to spend most of his time in the field, riding out to properties and helping to establish clear legal records that would stand against the kind of fraudulent claims that Harmon and Cross had used against Sallie. It was painstaking work and sometimes tedious, but it was honest, and he came home from it in the evenings with the settled satisfaction of someone who has found the work that suits them. On a Thursday evening in the fall of 1882, 4 years after Oliver had first ridden through Sallie's gate with a leather satchel and an offer she had refused, they sat together on the porch after supper with the children playing in the last of the evening light. Robert Thomas, now nearly 3, chasing the dog they had acquired that spring, a red-brown hound named Doc who had shown up at the gate one day and never left. And Clara me, 18 months old, sitting in the dirt at the bottom of the porch steps examining a fallen elm leaf with the methodical attention she brought to everything. The Oklahoma sky above them was the deep blue of early October, going amber at the horizon, and the elm tree was turning, its leaves the color of old gold, and the flat stones beneath it held their quiet memorial with the decorum they always had. Oliver had his arm around Sallie's shoulders on the porch and she was leaning against him, and neither of them was saying anything. They did not always need to talk. They had learned each other's silences the way you learn the particular sounds a house makes in different weather, not as absence but as another form of presence. After a while, Oliver said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first morning?" "I said a great many things the first morning," Sallie said. "You said because it is mine," he said. "When I asked why you would not sell," she was quiet, feeling the weight of 4 years in those 3 words. "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about it ever since," he said, "what it means to hold on to something, what it costs." "It cost me a great deal," she said, "and it gave me everything." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Yes," he said, "both things are true." Robert Thomas came running across the yard with Doc bounding beside him, both of them breathless and joyful in the way of small boys and large dogs who have each found in the other a perfect companion. Clara me watched her brothers approach with calm gray-green eyes and then reached up her arms to be picked up, and Sallie bent down from the porch step and brought her daughter up and felt the solid, warm weight of her settle on her hip, and Clara might put her small hand flat against Sallie's cheek the way she did sometimes, as though checking that her mother was still there and still real. She was there. She was entirely real. Oliver had come to buy her last acre, and she had refused him, and he had come back with seed potatoes and a willingness to set fence posts and the honest decency to tell her things she needed to know, and she had let him in slowly, carefully, without surrendering the self that the land had made her. And he had loved that self, the whole of it, the stubbornness and the silence and the grief and the capacity, and she had loved him back in the complete and unsentimental way she had learned to love. The kind that comes from working side by side through hard weather. The stars came out over the Cimarron Hills as the evening deepened, the same stars that had wheeled above the Oklahoma Territory since long before the fence posts and the plows and the roads that ran between the small towns, since long before any of them had been born to claim anything or refuse it. Below them, on one good acre, the Blackwell farm settled into the night, the house with its 2 new rooms and its straight walls built by Oliver's hands, the garden in its autumn quiet waiting for spring, the chickens in the proper coop, the elm tree with its gold leaves falling slow as breath over the stones where Thomas and Robert Wallace lay, honored and remembered in the living that went on around them. Sallie looked out at all of it and felt, as she often did in the evenings, the full weight and the full gift of it, the thing she had refused to sell, the man who had come to buy it and had been changed by the refusal, the life they had made together on the irreducible foundation of what she would not give up. "Oliver," she said. "Yes," he said, his arm around her, Clara Mee on her hip, Robert Thomas talking to the dog in the yard below in the elaborate and serious language of a child explaining the world to a creature he loves. "I am glad you came," she said. He held her closer. "I am glad you did not let me leave," he said. The stars moved above the Oklahoma Territory, ancient and indifferent and beautiful, and the night settled over the one good acre like a blessing freely given. And Sallie Wallace Blackwell held her daughter and leaned against her husband's chest and listened to her son's bright voice in the dark yard below, and felt the happiness the way she felt the land, as something real and earned and hers, and his and theirs. They kept the farm through all the hard years that followed, through the dry summer of 1883, when the wells in 3 neighboring properties gave out, and the bitter winter of 1884, when the livestock needed daily tending in temperatures that dropped well below freezing, and Oliver spent an entire week with his hands wrapped in wool rags because his gloves had worn through, and he would not stop long enough to go to Caldwell and buy new ones. And Sallie finally made him come inside on the 5th night and warmed his cold hands between both of hers and told him with considerable directness that he was the most stubborn man she had ever met, which she said without any intention of it being a complaint. He had looked at her in the lamplight with those dark eyes and said, "I learned stubbornness from the best teacher in the Oklahoma Territory," and she had laughed, and that laugh had warmed the kitchen better than the stove. Robert Thomas grew into a boy of great energy and curiosity, who was interested in everything and afraid of very little, and who asked questions from the moment he could form them until long after the patience of most adults would have been exhausted, but who had inherited, along with his father's dark hair, his mother's quality of listening as well as speaking, so that the questions were genuine and not performative. By the time he was 7, he could identify most of the native plants in the garden and could read well enough to work through the almanac on his own, and he had his father's aptitude for building things and his mother's aptitude for growing them. Clara Mee was quieter and more precise, with her mother's gray-green eyes and a way of observing a situation completely before she committed to anything. She had her father's patience and her mother's capacity for stubbornness, which was a combination that could be formidable in a child and was clearly going to be remarkable in an adult. She learned to ride before most children her age, and she learned to read almost without being taught, picking it up from watching her brother's lessons with the focused attention she brought to everything. In the fall of 1884, Sallie discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She was 32 years old, which she mentioned to the midwife as a statement of fact, and the midwife, a no-nonsense woman from Iowa named Mrs. Holt, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell's growing population, said that 32 was nothing to concern herself about, and she had delivered healthy babies to women considerably older. Oliver received the news with the same quality of feeling he had received it the first 2 times, that, particular combination of joy and something very close to awe. And he sat with Sallie that evening with his hand resting gently on the small of her back the way he did when he wanted her to know he was present, fully and without reservation. Their third child, born in May of 1885 with the characteristic timing of babies who arrive in inconvenient circumstances. In this case, during the middle of a spring planting that Oliver had been trying to get finished before the first rain, was a boy. They named him Eli James Blackwell, and he arrived into a household already well practiced at receiving new people, so that Robert Thomas received him with the authority of an experienced elder sibling, and Clara Mee, who was 4, considered him carefully and then said, with the measured judgment of someone who has given a matter full consideration, that he was very small but that she supposed he would do. He did. He grew up smaller and quieter than his brother and more observant than either sibling, with Oliver's dark eyes and Sallie's dark hair, and a disposition that was entirely his own, thoughtful, unhurried, the kind of child who is content to sit and watch things happen and then, when everyone else has stopped looking, do something unexpected. The 3 children grew up knowing the acre of their parents' life, knowing the elm tree and the flat stones beneath it, and the story of the men they commemorated, knowing the kitchen garden and the barn and the workshop and the 2 wells and the road that ran west to Caldwell and the Cimarron Hills on the horizon. They knew the story of how their father had come to buy the land and their mother had refused him, and something had changed in the space of that refusal that had made everything that came after possible. Robert Thomas, at 8 years old, asked his father about it directly one evening on the porch. "Did you really come to take the farm?" he said. Oliver looked at Sallie, who was braiding Clara Mee's hair on the other end of the porch and was clearly listening. "I came to buy it," Oliver said carefully. "There is a difference. But she didn't want to sell it," Robert Thomas said. "No," Oliver said, "she did not. So what made you stay?" Oliver was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard in the evening light, at the elm tree and the garden and the fence posts they had repaired together and replaced and repaired again over the years, at the land that was 1 acre but contained everything. "She did," he said. Robert Thomas considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Because she said no." "Because she said no and she meant it," Oliver said. "And because she knew what she was holding and she held it. And because I had never met anyone quite like her." He glanced at Sallie, who was looking over at him now with the gray-green eyes that still, after 7 years, managed to unsettle him in the best possible way. "And because I hope I was smart enough to know a rare thing when I found it." Sallie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the dry warmth that was entirely her own, "You were smart enough. Eventually." Robert Thomas laughed, and Clara Mee laughed because her brother laughed. And from inside the house where Eli was supposedly sleeping came a small sound that suggested he was not sleeping but had been listening, which was entirely consistent with his character. Oliver reached across the porch and took Sallie's hand, and she gave it, and the evening settled around them with the patience of evenings that have accumulated into years, layered and rich and solid as the dark Oklahoma soil. Frederick Aldrich wrote in the spring of 1886 to say that his firm had been retained by a coalition of small landholders in the territory who were pressing for what he called comprehensive protective legislation, and that he was citing the Blackwell case as a foundational precedent for the legal arguments he intended to make. He asked if Sallie and Oliver would be willing to provide formal testimony on the pattern of Harmon and Cross's operations. They both wrote back saying yes. The testimony was given in Guthrie in June, in a formal hearing room with tall windows and wooden benches, and Sallie gave her account of the 3 years of pressure and the fraudulent claim with the same directness she brought to everything. And the men on the hearing panel listened to her with the particular attention that people give when they recognize that they are hearing from someone who knows precisely what she is talking about. Oliver gave his account of the internal operations of Harmon and Cross, the tactics, the escalation protocols, the use of men like Cord Levis and Hector Prout, and he did it fully and without softening any of the details, accepting whatever professional consequences might come from it with the calm of a man who made his choice long ago and has never questioned the making of it. The legislation that resulted from that hearing and others like it was not perfect. It never was, in the territory, where the competing interests of development and settlement were powerful and entrenched, but it established clearer protections for documented landholders and created new reporting requirements for land acquisition companies, and it made the kind of fraudulent pressure that Harmon and Cross had used significantly more difficult and risky. It was not everything. There were people who had already lost what could not be gotten back, and the legislation did not reach backward to undo those losses. Sallie knew that, and the knowing of it was the one shadow that fell over the otherwise clear satisfaction of the outcome. But Aldridge said that the testimony had made the hearing possible and the legislation possible, and that was a real thing even if it was not a complete thing. On the ride back from Guthrie, with the children staying with the Haverfords for 2 nights, Oliver and Sallie rode through the late afternoon light of the Oklahoma summer and talked about all of it, the hearing, the testimony, the strange arc of the years between his first arrival at her gate and this present moment on the road home. "Your father would have testified too," Oliver said, "if he had been here." "He would have prepared better than I did," Sallie said. "He kept records of everything, every rainfall, every yield, every conversation with anyone who came to the property. He believed in documentation." "So does your son," Oliver said, smiling slightly. "I found a notebook under Robert Thomas's pillow last week in which he had documented every cat in the Caldwell area with descriptions and estimated ages." Sallie laughed full and genuine, the way she laughed when something genuinely delighted her. "He has his grandfather's instincts." "He does," Oliver said. There was warmth in his voice that was specific to how he spoke about the children, a particular quality of paternal feeling that Sallie found, after 7 years of being beside it, still moving. They rode home through the gold evening and turned through their gate, and the farm received them the way it always did, quietly and completely, the elm tree moving in the late breeze, and the chickens coming to the fence of the coop, with their particular chicken opinions about the lateness of the hour, and the smell of dry grass and the sound of the Cimarron in the distance, still running over its banks with the spring water. They had dinner late that night, just the 2 of them, and sat afterward on the porch in the quiet that the children's absence made strange, not an uncomfortable quiet but a different kind of one, a reminder of the version of themselves that existed before there were 3 voices and 3 sets of needs and a red-brown dog and the general energetic complexity of a family. "I was so afraid," Sallie said after a while, not explaining of what because she did not need to. "I know," Oliver said. "So was I when you came the second time," she said. "With the seed potatoes, I thought, what is this man doing? Who does this?" "A man who could not stay away," Oliver said. "You could not have known then," she said, "how it would turn out." "No," he agreed, "but I knew something. I knew you were—" He stopped, reaching for the right word with the care he brought to anything he meant precisely. "I knew you were someone I did not want to not know, if that makes any sense." She looked at him sideways in the dark. "It makes sense. And the rest of it," he said, "has been better than anything I could have known to hope for." She moved close to him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had been leaning against his shoulder for 7 years. And the Oklahoma stars came out above the Cimarron hills and the elm tree and the flat stones and the root cellar and the garden and the workshop and the well and all of it, the whole accumulated ordinary extraordinary life of the place, and they sat together in it and let it be exactly what it was, their one good acre, not sold, not surrendered, held, and made into something that neither Oliver Blackwell nor Sallie Wallace had been able to imagine, alone, on the morning he first rode through her gate with a satchel full of papers, and she stood on her porch with a shotgun and refused him. Refused him, and in that refusal began the best chapter of both their lives. In the years that followed those long good years, The Blackwell farm on the one Wallace Acre grew and deepened and became, in the region around Caldwell, something that people pointed to when they needed an example of what it looked like when a piece of land was loved. The plum tree Oliver had planted in the north corner grew broad and gave fruit every summer in abundance. The elm tree stayed, its canopy spreading wider each decade, its roots going down into the Oklahoma soil beside the two flat stones in a way that made it look as though the tree itself was keeping watch. Robert Thomas became a surveyor, which surprised no one who had known him as a boy with his notebook of Caldwell cats, and he worked for the territorial government documenting land holdings with the same honest precision his father had brought to the work. And he eventually settled on a farm of his own 30 miles north of Caldwell, with a quiet, capable woman named Jessie who had grown up on a neighboring ranch, and could ride and shoot and cook and had, Sallie told Oliver the first time she met her, an excellent sense of what mattered and what did not. Clara Me went to school in Guthrie, and then to a teaching college in Kansas City, which required arguments that the family had in a civil but thorough way over the course of one entire winter, with Clara Me presenting her position with the methodical certainty she brought to everything and Sallie and Oliver listening, and ultimately agreeing that a daughter who knew what she wanted and had the capacity to get it was not a thing to discourage. She came back to the territory and taught school in Caldwell for 10 years, and eventually married a schoolmaster from Guthrie named Philip who had, in the family's collective judgment, the right combination of intelligence and humility to be worthy of her. Eli, the thoughtful youngest, stayed closest. He took on carpentry work that extended and expanded what Oliver had built in the workshop, becoming known through 3 counties as a man who could build furniture of real beauty from the native wood. And he built his own house on a piece of land he purchased just a quarter mile from the family farm, close enough that Sallie could see the light in his windows from the porch in the evenings, which she found, without ever saying so directly, to be one of the particular quiet comforts of her later years. Oliver's hair went gray early, which he wore without vanity, and Sallie's went gray later and more gradually, and they both acquired in their 50s the quality that long-married couples develop when they have worked and talked and laughed and grieved and disagreed and made up and worked some more alongside each other for decades. A kind of shared rhythm that other people noticed without being able to name, a settling into each other's presence that was so complete it looked effortless. Even though both of them knew better than anyone that nothing worth having was effortless. It was only that the effort had become so continuous and so embedded in the fabric of daily life that it could no longer be distinguished from the living itself. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1895, 17 years after Oliver Blackwell had first ridden through Sallie's gate with his leather satchel and his careful voice and his offer she refused, they sat together on the porch after breakfast while the elm tree dropped its October leaves in the slow gold spirals that it had been dropping every fall for as long as either of them could remember. Robert Thomas was coming for dinner with Jessie and their 3 children. Clara Me and Philip had sent a letter that would arrive that week with news that Clara Me expected in the spring. Eli had been over 2 days prior to help Oliver repair the workshop roof, and had stayed for supper and talked for 3 hours about a commission he had taken for a church in Wichita. The land lay around them in the October morning, 1 acre, every inch of it known. The kitchen garden in its autumn quiet, the elm tree, the stones. Sallie had her coffee cup on the arm of her chair and her hands in her lap in the pale October light on her face, and Oliver looked at her the way he had been looking at her since he first stood in this yard with a crate of seed potatoes, with that absorbed, genuine, wondering attention that had never found a reason to diminish. "What?" she said, because she could feel it. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She looked at him sideways with those gray-green eyes. "You are still doing that." "I expect I will be doing it for whatever time I have left," he said, entirely without self-consciousness. She reached over and took his hand from the arm of his chair, the way she had been reaching for his hand for 17 years, and held it in both of hers, and looked out at the farm they had made together on the foundation of her refusal: the fence posts, the plum tree, the chicken coop, the workshop, the well, the elm tree with its flat stones, the road west to Caldwell, and the Cimarron Hills on the pale horizon. "I am glad I did not sell," she said. "So am I," he said. "Though I suppose," she said, with the dry warmth that was entirely hers, "that you came here planning to take it from me." "I came here planning to buy it," he said, "the old distinction. There is a difference." "There was a time," she said, "when I did not know that you knew the difference. There was a time," he said, "when I was not sure I did." She squeezed his hand, and the elm tree moved in the October wind, and somewhere up the road they could hear the sound of horses coming, Robert, Thomas, and Jessie arriving early, because their children had been asking since yesterday when they could go see their grandmother's garden, and Jessie could never keep them waiting longer than she had to. Sallie stood up from the porch chair with the ease of someone who has spent a lifetime in physical work and has the strength to show for it, and went to the gate to watch them come down the road in the morning light, her son, her daughter-in-law, her grandchildren raising a little cloud of dust in the fall air. And Oliver came to stand beside her at the gate, the way he had been coming to stand beside her since the spring of 1878. And they were still and quiet together for one moment while the horses came closer, and the elm tree moved behind them, and the whole weight and gift of the life they had built settled around them, solid and warm and completely, finally, irreducibly theirs. The gate was open. There was no need to hold a shotgun. There was nothing left to refuse, because no one was trying to take anything anymore, and everything worth having was already here, arrived at through years of honest work and plain dealing, and two people who had known how to hold on to what mattered and had had the sense, when the right moment came, to let each other in. Robert Thomas's eldest boy was already jumping from the wagon before it had stopped moving, running toward the gate with the uncomplicated joyfulness of a child who knows exactly where he is welcomed. And Sallie opened her arms as he reached the gate and held him, and Oliver put his hand briefly to her back, present, solid, there. And the October morning held them all in its pale gold light, complete and whole and finally, after everything, at rest.